Hello, I'm Stephen Ray, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
So just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it.
Well, I'm a Roman Catholic. I believe Jesus is Lord, and the Catholic Church is his university on earth. I was a skeptic most of my life. I came to believe it late in life. In my late 40s, I started seeing the philosophical arguments add up and start to make some sense. I still didn't believe it, but I really got into as much as I could, studying history and philosophy, and the details of life started coming together, and I thought it made sense. And long story short, I accidentally prayed to know the truth, and God gave me a supernatural experience that removed all doubt.
Wow. Did you have any infused knowledge with that, things that you hadn't learned?
Yeah, I could probably talk for hours about what happened in a few minutes. After I'd studied all the philosophy and history I could, I was really at my wit's end, and it was late one night, and I turned to this picture of Jesus that was on my computer, and I just said, is this really true? Could this really be true? And if you've seen that dolly zoom effect that Alfred Hitchcock uses in his movies, the world just zoomed by, and I felt like I was falling into a black tunnel. And God showed me many things. It's hard to describe because it's infused knowledge, like you say. He showed me things from his perspective, and it was so humbling that he's been with me my whole life. When I thought there was no God, or when I told people there was no God, he was there, and he's suffering at every moment. It's so humbling to say. Every sin in the world he's experiencing like a arrow to his heart. So he showed me that perspective, and later I realized I knew Catholic theology without ever studying it, because after this experience I started reading the Bible, and the Bible itself always seemed like gibberish to me, and it suddenly opened up like I had been there. I went to some Bible studies shortly thereafter, and we'd be reading through passages, and I just felt like I had so much insight about it. In a small group of 3 or 4 of us, we'd talk about the passages, and I don't know how, but I just had a deep sense of what each situation was. Not the entire Bible, but most of the New Testament. That's what kind of led me to the Catholic Church, because even after that infusion of knowledge, I didn't know what church was right. So I went to Bible studies and started looking around. And in one of those Bible studies, or in fact, it started coming up that 3 or 4 of us would have 3 or 4 different opinions. So I kept thinking, well, geez, somebody must have preserved this knowledge somewhere. So I started studying history more and commentaries, and I found a few that I really loved. And I started noticing, well, these are Catholic monks here. That makes sense because they stayed up in the mountains and studied this stuff all the time. I thought, they really got deep into this. So that attracted me to a lot. And then I watched a lot of debates about the historicity of the Catholic Church and so on. And there was this YouTube show with Fulton Sheen that I used to follow. I loved his commentaries. And then he would say something strange at the end of his videos I thought was the weirdest thing in the world. He would beg people to come to the church and spend time with the Lord. And I didn't know what he meant. He was talking about physically spending time with the Lord, and I didn't know what the heck that meant. And I found out that meant Eucharistic Adoration. And I thought that was the craziest thing I've ever heard. But I was ready for anything after that conversion experience. So I went into a chapel to pray about it, and I was about 6 feet away from the Eucharist, and I looked up and I saw the face of Christ appear right in front of the Eucharist, life size, just the face. And I didn't know what to think. I thought, does this happen all the time?
Was it a still image like a photograph or moving like a real life?
It was a still image, life size, 3D. I saw the curvature of his brow. He was looking down. I got the sense he was on the cross. A very humble face, slightly turned to one side, so beautiful and humble. And it only lasted about 5 or 10 seconds and went away. And I never saw it again. But later on in the week, I went out to the same church and I saw this poster that said Divine Mercy. And I said, well, I've seen that face before. It's a face of Jesus. And that must have been where it came from. So then I found out there's a long story, and that's an important thing within the Catholic Church, the image of Divine Mercy. And even to the point where St. Faustina described how when she had the image painted, she cried because it didn't represent Jesus. And I know exactly what she means. He's so beautiful and humble. And I can see the artist try to capture it, but it's very hard.
Have you seen the 3D projections of the Shroud of Turin, and does that match your perception of Jesus' face?
Actually, not so much. Sure, I believe the Shroud of Turin is real, but the image is a little different, skinnier face. Although I know he was beat up pretty badly before that image was taken. But it's similar. The image that I saw was hard to describe. It was a rough shape. It was definitely his face that I could match to the Divine Mercy, but it's was more rounded than when I see on the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, well, what you saw was a face hanging, the flesh hanging from the face downward, and in the Shroud of Turin, the flesh is hanging back because he's lying on his back, presumably.
Yeah, and he went through a lot before that shroud was put on him. I know. You can see the bruise in his cheek.
Well, yeah, there was more blood in him when you saw him, probably.
Yeah.
Is all suffering going to cease for God once the end of time comes and once we enter into eternity with him?
Wow, I think so. All tears will be wiped away. But I think I had this model image of what hell is kind of a exhaust for God. It's his sense of shame, or not regret, but it's his way of dealing with all the suffering. And like Jesus said, it's Gehenna. It's like the waste of all that emotion expressed outwards. Like I think St. Faustina said, hell is fueled by God's anger. I think of it as anguish. So it's there, but it's somehow focused to where hell is.
So do you remember the exact moment when you decided that the church which Christ built is the Catholic Church and no other church, and that all other churches are in an imperfect relationship with this one true church? Was it that moment when you saw the face of Jesus during adoration?
Not quite. I still was struggling to know what was true, and I saw that image and I still had some doubts. And because I was an extreme skeptic for my whole life, I really hated the Catholic Church, and I believed the propaganda about it. It committed all these murders and mass killings throughout history, and it's been the worst thing that ever happened. So I was still studying the history of the Catholic Church and found quite the opposite to be true. But I worked up my courage to go ask for a spiritual advisor. I found out that the church had spiritual advisors to talk to. And I guess I know now it was a demonic attack pulling me away from doing that. It took all my courage to get that far. I think the devils didn't want to let me go. And when I finally walked in to those sessions, I got lucky with a spiritual advisor. I was trying to rationalize everything, and I thought, maybe I can figure all this out. And this spiritual advisor told me, God just wants your heart. He wants your love. And somehow that just clicked with me. And that's when I knew, shortly after that, I knew that the Catholic Church was founded by Jesus, and it's overseen by the Holy Spirit, and it's been the best thing that's ever happened to the world. It took me a lot of reading and fact digging to see through all the propaganda against the Church, the Spanish Inquisition, those things.
How many years ago did you formally enter full communion with the Holy Roman Catholic Church?
Well, I was born Catholic and baptized, confirmed in 8th grade. Then I left for 40 years. And so it's been about, I came back and I asked if I needed to do anything to come back, because the church was the furthest thing from my mind. And that was about 4 or 5 years ago. The priest told me I was welcome back with open arms.
Did you get any sort of closure where it's like, yes, I am in? Because I was baptized in a Protestant religion, so I was not able, unfortunately, to repeat my baptism, but I was able to have the sacrament of confirmation, which I had never had. So that gave me a sort of closure on my atheistic Satanism and all the stupid worldviews that I dabbled with. I was able to give closure to that and have a sort of ceremony, which was also a sacrament, and the graces that come with the sacrament. But it was like a very poignant and pivotal moment that I could mark on my calendar. Did you have something like that when you came back home to the church?
Maybe at confession, my first confession, when I worked up my courage to go to my first confession. That was very distinct, yes. After I had that conversion experience, I had this very real sense of God. God was more real to me than the rest of the world and the rest of experience. So I realized every thought and every deed where I denied God was hurting him. And I was carrying that with me. And so I had this deep sense of regret for that. And there was a priest at the church that I got to know, and he was very kind. And in fact, he's passed away now. He was in a wheelchair at the time, and he was very kind in a way that made it easy to go with him to confession. And I asked him to block out some time I told him I had 30 or 40 years built up. And so we went into a room after the regular confession, and I let everything go. Very emotional. I needed a lot of Kleenex. And just that in itself, it felt like a cleansing process. Like I had just gotten out of the shower, and he gave me absolution, and I just felt like 100 tons had been lifted off my back, and I could breathe again. It was so beautiful. I can see the beauty of God's design in doing that physically, because I admire Protestants that they can do that, seek absolution, but having that physical, real, face-to-face contact makes it so much more real.
What about sin? Can you talk about how the sacraments, prayer and the sacraments and your faith in general, how they help you to tackle your sins, to grow in virtue, and to improve your life morally? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, the sacraments. Well, I mainly see the Eucharist. I fully believe in every way the Eucharist is the most holy thing on earth. It's the greatest miracle in the universe every time it's raised at an altar. And it has a very cleansing effect when I take the Eucharist. I imagine God trying to strip away all the darkness and faults of my heart. It's like a miracle every time I go. I don't have a supernatural experience. Like I've had a few times, and if I'm in the right spirit, it's very emotional for me to go to Mass, because I see Calvary there. And I'm very devoted to Mary, and I followed the St. Louis de Montfort's devotion to Mary, and do the first 5 Saturdays of confession for 5 months. I do it every month, actually. And that's always a cleansing experience. I'm trying to think of the other sacraments besides confession and Eucharist.
Well, did your marriage get renewed?
Oh, yeah, I could see how our lives were careening towards chaos. We were just trying to do the best we could. My wife's a real good person, and I try to be a good person. But even with all that, we're always, we were starting to have a lot of friction and, ego battles and things. And knowing Christ is the only way that I could see that two people could get along. I've been married a long time, 27 years now. And without Christ, I don't know what we would do, because, I think two people will grow to have a lot of friction unless they have that separate love in Christ to both strive for, Because there's times when I don't even like myself, right? So the odds of two people being perfectly in harmony together is pretty rare, I would think. And united in Christ gives you that external, like a rule of law that you both can agree to. And so everything's been going a lot better since. And with my family and children, I can see things blossoming. I'm really fearful for what would have happened if I would have stayed on the road of a non-believer. It's very scary to me.
Are your wife and kids amenable to entering into full communion with the Catholic Church eventually?
Yes, my wife is Lutheran, but she's expressed she will enter into the Catholic Church completely, which is a great joy for me. And my kids are kind of bound to the world still a good bit, and one foot in the church and one foot out. So that's my new goal.
So there are many things I want to talk to you about. I guess just talk a little bit about your prayer life, please.
Yeah, I'm only about 4 or 5 years into this, so I probably have an immature prayer life compared to other people. But I try to think of Jesus and Mary with me. I'm a very visual person. I can imagine them standing with me and where I go and what I do. So that really changes the way where I go and what I do. I don't watch the movies I used to watch. I don't go to the places I used to go to. Not that I went anywhere bad, but just going into a bar with smoke and drinks and things is no place I would take Jesus or Mary. So I avoid those if I can. And I don't know if that counts as a prayer, but I have them on my mind a lot. And I think what they would think as I go through life, try to serve Jesus as much as I can. But I do as many rosaries as I can every morning, every night. I call it the Triple Crown when I do all the mysteries, Mass, and Adoration in one day.
Wow.
That takes about 3 hours. So,
wow.
I would do it all day, every day if I could, but I still work in the corporate world.
Amazing. It's amazing, though. What's your view of indulgences?
Indulgences? Oh,
Are you aware of indulgences? Do you make a conscious request for indulgences every day?
I don't. I know I believe in all the church teachings, and I'm probably not using the indulgences correctly. But I believe they're valid, and I just don't know how to use them.
It's just to have the intention to gain an indulgence, and it's going to eat away at all the temporal punishment due to your sin. And then once you're in the clear, once you've been paid off, then you can start giving some to your family and friends and everyone else. So it's just like this treasury that you can dip into to pay off your debt and then to pay off other people's debts, like making reparation by means of indulgences. And the way to get an indulgence is simply to have the intention of getting an indulgence. And every time you raise your thoughts to God, you are able to ask for an indulgence. So it's a tricky habit to get into. I'm not completely in the habit, but I think about it often enough that eventually I'll get in the habit of always having the intention to get an indulgence for every time I lift my thoughts to God. And if you're walking around with Jesus and Mary, then you are in constant prayer. That's a constant state of prayer. So you should just remind yourself once in a while to have the intention to get indulgences. It's all about that punishment that's due to your sins. And it will really help a lot of people if you can get in the habit of doing that. So I would encourage you to do that.
Very cool. I'm going to check into that more. I wear the scapular and done some novenas that promised indulgences, I believe. But I tell you, I'm really busy with my work life and family life. I probably, that's the most frustrating part. I feel called to do something else, but God gave me the gift of my vocation, and I'm doing that for now until I can find something that's more close to His will. I would join a monastery if I could, but I asked a priest about it, and he said, well, God gave you your family. That's your vocation for now. So make sure that's done well before you screw something else up.
Yeah. One thing that I'm excited about is young earth creationism. Can you talk a little bit about evolution, young earth creationism, where you stand, why you believe what you believe now? And if you believed something different before, just talk a little bit about the journey there, if you would.
Oh, yeah. For most of my life, I was fully in bed with popular science opinion and evolution, everything that you see in the Science Channel or Discovery Channel. That was my favorite channel. I've probably seen every show on it and fully believed in evolution, and that Cosmos series that Carl Sagan put on and Neil deGrasse Tyson did a new version recently. I was fully on board with. And in my computer science work, one of the things I work with is evolutionary algorithms. So it all kind of made sense how you could have a random pool that generates a fit solution and things like that. But about 2 years ago, I started reading more about computational biology, and I've worked on a couple of related projects. I do software for analytics, and my customers do these projects. And so I got to see how some of these things might add up. And when I started realizing how the microbiology works to get from DNA into a specific protein, I thought, well, geez, that's like an encryption algorithm that you have to go through the folding to get the desired shape that has to be perfect for it to do its function. And so random mutations in DNA, I thought, well, that's crazy. That's like to get the right DNA that goes through the ribosome and does the folding that comes out to the right shape. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine. It's just crazy odds. And I really started losing my faith in evolution. This was after my conversion experience. I still believed in, or assumed that evolution was true, and abiogenesis, that these molecules could come together and do these things. But as I looked more closely, I realized there is no way that these things could happen without guided intelligence. So I followed a lot of what's on the Discovery Institute, discovery.org. They have a lot of good content about this with people that know a lot more about biology than I do. Dr. James Torr, Michael Behe. I think it's so much more beautiful, and to realize that God did these things, and that's something that's grown just in my few years in the faith. Just learning to appreciate everything around us, that like the fact that a dog is loyal, has unconditional love, and a cat enjoys to be petted. For the DNA to be mutated in such a way that those things come out is kind of ridiculous. I see God's designs in these things, and it makes me love God that much more. Especially in the personality in people and things in nature. And of course, your point about the Immaculate Conception of Mary is probably the funniest thing I ever heard on YouTube. I'm an avid listener. I used to do podcast apps, but now I listen to most everything through YouTube. And the absolute funniest thing in all my thousands of hours on YouTube was when you told Aaron Ra that you realized evolution wasn't true because of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Because I used to think like exactly like him. I know where he's coming from, where all these atoms come together and evolve into different shapes. And you might as well have spoken Vulcan to him, I think. I'm amazed he didn't flip out. But it is a beautiful thing. I think when I realized that Jesus turned water into wine, and then I think about how he made Adam and Eve, I'm sure he didn't pick two random monkeys out of a tree and say, "Okay, you're good enough. Let's go. Let's go with you guys."
So, what's your beef with theistic evolution? I don't buy into theistic evolution. I think it's ridiculous. But obviously, you don't buy into theistic evolution either. What's your reason why you don't believe it?
Oh well, I have this holistic view of God that He is a mind, and everything in the universe is within that mind. So I don't see that I have to refute theistic evolution. I just see God's providence in everything from the bottom up. You know what I mean? So it's not like there's anything out of His control that He just lets run wild, other than letting creatures sin. I believe everything is in His control and providence. Does that answer your question?
No. I mean, is it an affront to reason and an affront to the character of God to preach theistic evolution, yes or no?
Of course, yes. It's like saying that God accidentally allowed this to happen. I mean, to me, I have this very firm foundation that God is the basis of everything. There's nothing that doesn't happen without His will or His permission. Always be careful to say about sin. He allows sin to happen, but that's because He respects the will of His created beings to commit those errors.
The reason that this is so important to me is because I see very few Catholics today who actually believe one of the most important realities in salvation history, which is the fall of Adam and Eve. So I find it really of the utmost importance that we reinstill this belief in the history of the first chapters of Genesis. And I find it tragic that it's not being emphasized in the church today. There is the Kolbe Center and a handful of bishops speak out about creationism.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's destructive to the foundation and formation of children to think that they're animals. For me, I'm in the software business. I think as an engineer from fundamentals and build up in layers from that. And so I wouldn't see it from the historical aspect. I see it from the foundational aspect of God's mind is sustaining every atom in the universe. So when a human being comes together, what is a person? It's the formed from the dust. History doesn't happen on its own or by chance. God is guiding everything and allowing everything to happen. So from the way I view things, if you have that simple mustard seed of a foundation, and you could build up understanding of everything on that, the fact that God is sustaining everything. So how we got to Adam and Eve, it's absolutely tragic how children believe that they're animals. They tend to start to behave like animals. So it's devastating. I've approached my daughter's school to see about having them introduce creation and support creation. I'm checking into which school books they're using for that. But I'm really encouraged to see like the Discovery Institute, the science, as we discover more of the complexities and intricacies of life, it's become more justified. That we have hundreds of nanorobots running around in cells doing these amazing things. And that's something Darwin didn't know. He just kind of whitewashed it all. Say, well, it just adds up to a new species. Little changes grow into big changes. And the science doesn't pan that out.
Is the Discovery Institute an ecumenical movement in the sense that there are Catholics and non-Catholics, monotheists of different stripes, or what is it made up of in terms of religious adherence?
Yeah, it's got a mix of Protestants and Catholics, and even I think some non-believers who are just realizing this is pretty miraculous, this life that's around us. And I think that maybe in God's providence, he struck the right mark of delineation to say, "Yeah, let's not make this a religious movement. Let's base it on science alone to show that there's machines running around your body, inside your cells." I think Richard Dawkins even admitted that it does appear that some alien intelligence seems to have created this. But I guess Richard Dawkins hasn't thought about the infinite regress, which that would lead to think that another intelligence must have created them, and so on.
Yeah. What about Christian unity? What's your vision? What's your hope? What's your fear when it comes to Christians getting together, particularly the Catholic and the Orthodox as a start, but then right on down through the Protestant denominations? And can you just talk a little bit about that spectrum there?
I see the role that why God allows these factions to kind of split off the way the world is fallen. I see it as kind of an on-ramp or an off-ramp to the full faith. Otherwise, if we didn't have that, there'd be this giant step into Catholicism that people would just maybe not be able to take. I really struggle with the thought of people going to hell and not being able to face God, and I wonder, how Protestants will be able to do that, if with their heart. And I can't judge their heart, but I have this mixed feelings. Like I'm in awe that they can keep the faith without the sacraments of the Eucharist. I mean, it's amazing to me. Like the greatest gift in the universe is right there. They don't have it, but they have a strong belief, and they do good things. So I have this image of God's judgment. It isn't really so much God judging, it's whether or not they can stand God's truth, with the invincible ignorance and all. If they didn't know better, I guess they can stand to God's truth. And maybe in a way the Catholics are disadvantaged because we've been given the truth and we usually don't live up to it. So maybe things are harder for us.
What do you think of Mary's role in Christian unity? Can you talk a little bit about the Protestants and how they treat Mary? Some treat her just as a throwaway vessel for the incarnation. Others say the rosary. There are Protestants now that are saying the rosary. So there's a whole spectrum of levels of respect for Our Lady. Can you just talk a little bit about her role in Christian unity from your perspective, please?
Yeah, I wish everyone knew how much Mary is. She's our mother. She's the mother of every person. And it's so beautiful. I see the whole Bible and our story of salvation kind of through Mary. It would sound, I guess, offensive to a Protestant, but it's really so beautiful. The battle between good and evil isn't so much between God and the devil. God could destroy the devil at every moment. It's really about God saving mankind, and the one person who's free from sin is Mary, and she's leading the battle for us, and we're born of her. I don't know if this makes sense, but I see her as the lead at the front of humanity's salvation that God ordained. In the same way of in the Old Testament, the Jews carry the ark in front. I see her in that way, as the vessel that was dispensing the graces that we all can use to win the battle.
Well, there's that imagery in the book of Revelation, I think, that you're bringing to mind.
Well, it's the whole Bible. I see it this way, that at the beginning in Genesis 3, you have God setting enmity between the devil and the woman. So, okay, these are the battle lines. You got the woman and the devil at the beginning. In the middle of the Bible, Mary turns to Jesus and asks him to bring more wine. They're out of wine. I think that was the intercession that brought grace to humanity. And of course, Jesus is the ultimate source of grace that helps humanity win this battle against the devil. God is rooting for us to win, but that we have to win on our own free will. And of course, Revelations wraps that up with the woman clothed in the sun. I kind of see as a bookmark Mary front to back and in the middle of the Bible, as if the Bible, really follows her story or the humanity story, not so much God. who's infinite. We don't understand every infinite thing about God, but we understand our own human drama, which is kind of played out, centered on Mary.
I recently interviewed a nice young man who happens to be some sort of Calvinist, I think. But he recommended to me that Mary had sinned at the wedding of Cana because it was obviously not God's will that Jesus start his public life, but she bullied him into it. And this was a great sin. And she did not obey the will of God, and she forced Jesus to do something that God did not want him to do. Can you just sort of rebut that from your own intuition? And what do you see? Why would this young man say that? And what do you think really happened at Cana in regards to obedience and who's wearing the pants in that family and these sorts of questions?
Yeah, this is probably one of the main things that turned me away from non-denominationalism. We were doing Bible studies and someone read that verse where Jesus responds, what does this have to do with you and me? It's not my hour. And a lot of Protestant interpretations turn that into an insult back to Mary, which would mean that Jesus is dishonoring his own mother. But I knew that couldn't be right, which is one reason I sought out other commentaries. And I see it as something more deep and beautiful in that Mary's fate as mother of humanity and Jesus's fate were bound together, which is why Jesus asked, what does this have to do between you and I? Because I see God as marrying humanity. He's humbled himself to become wed with humanity through Mary. And it's so beautiful that God would do that. And for Protestants to turn it into an insult, it's really hard for me to stand. There was another part to your question I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it would seem to some Protestants that Mary was going against the will of God because Jesus is God incarnate, and he was basically saying no, and she said just do it, and so it would seem that she sinned by going against God's express will there.
Yeah, I would just add that it's kind of funny to think that anyone would believe that Mary was talking about beverages at a wedding. She was talking about this. She was advocating for humanity, for spirit and grace, for God, by saying they're out of wine. And Jesus said that when he came, it was the worst generation. They had fallen. They've run out of grace and love for God. And Mary was pointing that out on behalf of Israel and humanity to say, please, they need more wine. It's so beautiful. I see her as the intercessor for mankind in that way, and other ways, of course. When I go to pick out a Bible, I always turn to that John 2 to see how they translated that. And if it seems to come across as an insult in English, I put it back down. So I use RSVCE or the NAB.
Okay. I think you know by now that I place a lot of emphasis on docile and loving submission to the Vicar of Christ. Can you just talk about the Pope generally and then talk specifically about the current Pope?
Well, my perspective is probably jaded by all the decades I spent in the corporate world where I had a lot of good and bad bosses. There was a CEO of a company that wouldn't agree with, but the job required obedience. So the Catholic hierarchy comes very naturally to me in that way. And, of course, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. So I have very low expectations of the Pope. I don't have the grace that you seem to have this admiration for some popes that you do. I do get goosebumps when I hear certain popes speak, like John Paul II. I don't get that sense from the current Pope. I think you know that I'm really concerned about his stepping into the world with environmentalism and all these crazy things. And he didn't even say the word Christ when he spoke at the word UN, maybe once or twice. I just can't understand why a pope would go on a stage and not speak about Christ to a big audience, and instead spend 30 minutes talking about the environment or something. But I trust in God's providence that even if we get a bad pope, it's good for the long run. And I submit in obedience, but I feel called to speak out within the limit of my authority. If I disagree, I think St. Robert Bellarmine spells that out. And I'm not a canon lawyer, but I think it's brilliant what God did. If you look at it, if you look at all of us like sheep or cats trying to be herded, the simplest way to keep us united is to have a figurehead. Pardon my language, but to put one idiot in charge. He doesn't want to deal with a billion idiots. So it's simple to say, when it comes time to discern doctrine, I'm going to deal with this one guy. You follow him and you'll be okay. And Jesus said the same thing when he was on earth, to do what they say or do what they teach, but not what they do. And that's the way I see it.
What do you make of my strong emphasis on Noah and the ark as a symbol for the Pope and the Church? Do you agree with it? Do you think I've put too much emphasis on that typology?
Oh, I think it's dead on. And I keep thinking back to every time you say that or someone else says that, I think of how God has acted throughout history, from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses. He's always had a line of patriarchs to be the father and teacher for the faith. And, Malachi 3:6 says that, I'm the Lord, I do not change. So the line of the popes makes perfect sense to me, that, Pope Francis is the 265th successor to Peter. I see that God is continuing to do what he's always done. And a lot of those patriarchs have been bad, but they managed to keep the doctrine of the faith. And I think it's beautiful. And there's several other figures besides the ark for the church. I think Mary is a figure for the church. Of course, Jerusalem.
You recommended that I read that book by St. Robert Bellarmine about the Antichrist. I finished reading it and it was interesting, but I want you to comment, if you could, about the Protestant perspective on the Pope, not Pope Francis in particular, but the popes in general, the papacy, I guess we could say. Can you just talk, again, in the context of Christian unity, can you just talk a little bit about what the Pope is for the Protestant or the non-Catholic Christian? What's going on there psychologically and spiritually?
Yeah, I think it's another beautiful thing about God's design. When God does something, it's so true at so many levels. When he appointed Peter and a line of patriarchs to follow, it wasn't just to have a single point of contact. It was to teach humility and obedience, because maybe heaven, life eternal, requires this docile obedience and loyalty. And having a good or a bad pope helps us learn that here on earth. And it's a beautiful thing. So God is, we're here on earth training for eternal life. And so the papacy is something that helps us prepare for that. And I see something oddly parallel between atheists and Protestants when they reject the Pope, because it's kind of this father wound pattern where someone's trust is broken. This father wound, if you look at Google for that on the internet, you'll find how a lot of atheists, famous atheists, have this broken relationship with their father, and that causes them to fall into atheism. And with Protestants, they kind of still have this father issue where they don't want to have anything between them and what they think their relationship to God is. They don't, or actually the Pope isn't between them. He's there to serve them. Their Bible came to us through the Catholic Church. So the Pope and the Church is serving mankind, yet they put up this false idea. You'll see them say I'm not going to be obedient to that guy. He's not my daddy. He's not my father. So both atheists and Protestants that reject the Pope, this kind of father issue, daddy issue.
Yeah, I'm still astonished that God humbled himself so much throughout salvation history, but especially in the incarnation and being born as a tiny babe in humble beginnings, obviously, and then all the the difficulties of the ordeals that the Holy Family had to pass through. It's unbelievable how humble God is. And I think that if we're not imitating Jesus Christ in his humility, then it doesn't really matter if we've got the Bible memorized and we can win every argument on the internet. If you haven't at least sincerely striven to imitate the humility of Jesus Christ, I think it's fair to say that you might have missed the entire point of Christianity, no?
Yeah, exactly. I used to joke that was a proof for the Catholic Church being true, because God wants humility, and there's nothing more humiliating than being Catholic. But once I grew to love the church, I stopped using that joke.
I've always struggled with the distinction. I don't know if it's a true distinction or a false distinction between weak but well-intentioned members of the hierarchy, the popes, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, and everyone else. Those who have good intentions but who are weak and end up doing disgusting things, either sexually or financially or whatever. And then those who hate God, but they have found their way into the church in order to try to destroy the church. These are the true wolves in sheep's clothing. Can we consider the first group that I mentioned, those who are just weak, are they wolves also, or are they just wounded sheep? Can you just sort of clarify for me, how strong is that distinction, or is it a blurred line, or does Satan have both groups firmly in their grips, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I really hadn't thought about it, which is more destructive. I think political scientists will say keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and that way the weak faithful are kind of more destructive, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So you'll see, like in a lot of churches, they'll say, it would be really nice if we brought in some drums and tambourines, and they're really serving themselves, their own self-interest in that way, because they don't have the full faith. And I do see that as maybe even more destructive than the outwardly corrupt people that know they don't believe. And it's hard to say, because they've gotten high positions in the church now, both sides. I don't know which one is worse. I should say that I don't think the ones that are high up in the church are malicious. I think there's a few that fall in socially, that they want to be part of a big organization. They love the political involvement and the attention. And I don't think there's very many that are truly malicious. You know what I mean?
Okay. Well, when we read historical documents from the Freemasons or the Communist Party that talk about a plan to infiltrate the highest reaches of the Catholic Church, do you think they've had any success with that, or no?
Oh, yeah. I think the Alta Vendita, the Freemasons have put it in writing since Voltaire. They said after the French Revolution failed, they wanted to destroy Christianity and the Catholic Church specifically. And pretty quickly, or through a few decades, infiltrated the Jesuits and educational institutions, and that I saw that happen in the U.S. at the secular level too. And I think they have a lot of that mentality. Not so much the organization, but the mentality lives on within the church. I think they've succeeded at maybe all levels of the church with that. The graying of the faith, if you know what I mean. The
watering down it.
Yeah, watering down the faith. Yeah, the stuff with the environmentalism and social issues, I see as evidence of that.
Okay, anything that's progressive and left or whatever.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. But you don't seem to see what I see in terms of the right, the infiltration by the right, and the dangers of the right. It seems like you're completely oblivious to the dangers of the right, no?
What do you mean by the right?
Those who are emphasizing the good old days and how the current pope is horrible and we should go back to the good old days when we had strong, faithful, conservative popes and everything was rosy. right?
Oh, I don't have that rosy view. I guess some people do, that everything was perfect before the Vatican II. I don't have that idealistic view. Um, I do see, like, I don't know if conservative is the right word for it, but like people that have large families, that work in business, that have to hold to prudence and fortitude, that whatever that is, if you call it conservative, I see that. I'm in that vein, and maybe it gets tainted with the right.
Well, I have a lot of, not a lot, but I do have friends online, like on social media and stuff like that, who are bombarding me every day with anti-Pope Francis propaganda. And it's mixed in with a whole bunch of traditional teachings of the church, like stuff that I love: devotion to Mary, devotion to the saints, the established tradition of the church, and so on and so forth, morality, the Ten Commandments. And they mix this stuff that I love in with anti-Pope Francis Pope bashing. And to me, that is just as insidious and pernicious as someone on the left preaching more charity, less clarity, and having compassion for those who suffer from same-sex attraction. And I recently started following Father James Martin on Twitter and Facebook, just to sort of get something from the left side of the spectrum, even though I know he's straying from Jesus Christ. But I just wanted to counterbalance all the right-wing propaganda I'm getting. And I have to say, so far, I haven't seen anything that's really damning. And I like to have that counterbalance. But it seems that you would be a little bit more comfortable with the Pope bashing than I am, right?
Well, yeah, it's mixed bag. I mean, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, so I guess it's not the question of the bashing; it's how you deal with it, with constructive criticism. I think there's a constructive way to do it in charity, and then there's a destructive way. And I would agree that gossip and clamoring is destructive and divisive, but there's a unifying way to do it, and that's where I would like to believe that I am. And we had the Pachamama symbols in the Vatican, or in one of the churches next to the Vatican, and I think it's incumbent upon a faithful Catholic to voice objection. And I don't think that Pope Francis ordered those things to be there. Maybe he did, but if he did, I would voice my objection. I would say, do you know the history of these things? Maybe you don't know it. See, I've worked for so many types of bosses. I see these patterns play out. So maybe he's just unaware or just going along with the process. I don't think he has malice. Yeah, even these sinister actors in the church, I really don't think they're out to hurt the church. They're out to serve themselves, and that hurts the church.
There's a lot of talk about Trump. He's the only president of the United States that I ever got excited to cheer for during election, and he won. And I still can't believe it. I still can't believe that he's the president of the United States. But the reason I'm excited is that he seems to be more pro-life than any other president. Is that true? And what's your impression in terms of the sort of the mystical salvation history unfolding in this great nation of the United States of America? What is the role of Trump in God's plan for humanity? How do you see that?
God creates these perfect souls in each of us, and we tend to corrupt ourselves. And the devil's enjoying corrupting each of us, and God comes along and makes something good out of it. And I think that's the way I think of Trump. He pursued wealth and women and all these things, and the devil was probably laughing the whole time. Look at, you gifted this man with so much. Look what he's done with it. And God was probably biding his time, and he said, "Wait and see. I'm going to have a place for him in time where it's going to fit just perfectly into what's needed." Being a brash loudmouth, I think that's the only thing that could have survived in D.C., to stand up to the corruption. And with all his flaws, it was perfect what we needed. I think he is the most pro-life president and has a lot of other qualities, and he has some faults too, but I don't think anybody more Christian or Catholic could have gotten elected in the U.S. It was amazing. I think it was divine providence that got him elected.
Is that an unpopular opinion down where you are?
No, it's pretty pretty common amongst people I know. That I think the shock to the rest of the world was that they saw all his flaws, and they don't understand. Non-Christians don't understand that this forgiveness and mercy that God has, that he sees our flaws and uses them. They expect somebody perfect or pretending to be perfect. I think it's better to have acknowledge one's flaws.
Mm-hmm. So what do you, you don't know Donald Trump as a man, you don't know him personally, but are you under the impression that he's getting more religious as he gets older? I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that he must be, but can you talk about some sort of hints or clues that maybe he believes in God, maybe he's Christian, maybe he worships, other than just sort of some sort of card-carrying allegiance to a Methodist church or something like that?
Well, there's a lot of non-denomination evangelicals that are praying for him. I just seem to see the effects of that. He seems to be a true believer in what he says and what he does. He shows great love for the people that serve the country and others. I see this humanity in him, that he's not faking it. He doesn't think about it. He just says it. I love that. And that's one good sign that I think he does have true faith. It's a shame that he doesn't realize the other side of the faith with the I think he's still into women a little bit, probably in wealth. But his sister is a Catholic judge. His wife is a Catholic. His vice president's an ex-Catholic. And he has a lot of Catholics in his cabinet. I think anyone more Catholic would not have gotten elected. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm kind of afraid what's going to happen, the backlash when Trump's not in office. I think we're going to get, the pendulum's going to swing the other way.
So on a bright and cheery and hopeful note, I always like my guests to end the show. So what do you think you might be able to say to anyone that's out there listening, whether they're atheist, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Buddhist, Muslim, Jew, or whatever? What do you think you might be able to say?
Yeah, if you're a skeptic or not in the church or don't believe in God, I would encourage you to really not sit idle and get comfortable in your beliefs. Really look for the truth and address your doubts. Dig deeper. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door shall be opened. That took me 30 to 40 years, but I finally found the truth. And if you pursue it with an open heart and in virtue, I'm confident that God will connect with you. He's waiting for you. You're not a random collection of molecules. You're a person that God decided to make. He looked at the universe and said the best thing that could be is you. And he created you for a purpose, to be with him forever in eternity.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.